Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's the kind of story that makes you question everyone you trust and everyone you love. Billionaire. A wedding just weeks away. And a woman in a maid's uniform who knew a secret that could destroy everything. Nobody saw what was coming that rainy night. Not even him. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll never look at perfect the same way again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this community reaches. Today's story is one of the most emotional, heart-pounding tales we've ever shared. A story about loyalty, betrayal, and a love that almost came too late. Trust me, you're going to want to watch this one all the way through because the twist near the middle changes absolutely everything. Let's get into it. First, everything seemed normal. Daniel Whitfield was the kind of man magazines loved to write about. 38 years old, self-made. A real estate empire spread across 3 states. And a face that looked like it belonged on a billboard rather than behind a desk. He'd built everything from nothing. A small construction crew in Ohio that grew into Whitfield Development, one of the fastest-growing companies on the East Coast. But wealth, as Daniel often said, was never the point. Purpose was. He lived in a sprawling estate just outside Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of house with white columns and a garden that looked like something out of a painting. And in that house, for the past 2 years, worked a woman named Maria Delgado. Maria wasn't just staff to Daniel. She'd started as his housekeeper, but somewhere along the way, she became something closer to family. She was the one who remembered his mother's birthday when his assistant forgot. She was the one who noticed when he skipped meals during stressful weeks and quietly left soup outside his office door. She never asked for recognition. She simply cared in the way people do when kindness is just part of who they are. Maria had come to America from Guatemala 8 years earlier, working 3 jobs at once just to send money home to her younger brother, who was studying to become a doctor. She rarely spoke about her past, but anyone who watched her closely could see the weight she carried, the quiet strength of someone who had survived more than she let on. Daniel noticed things about people. It was part of what made him successful in business. And it was part of what made him trust Maria completely. He never treated her differently because of her position. In fact, some evenings when the house was empty and the sun dipped low over the garden, they'd sit on the back porch and talk. About dreams, family, the kind of life neither of them ever thought they'd have. But there was someone else in Daniel's life. Someone who didn't feel the same warmth toward Maria. Her name was Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was stunning, sharp, and calculated in every sense of the word. She'd met Daniel at a charity gala 18 months earlier, and within 6 months, she was wearing his ring. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, the billionaire and the socialite, always photographed at the right events, always smiling for the cameras. But behind closed doors, Vanessa's smile faded the moment she was alone. She hated how much Daniel trusted Maria. She hated the way his eyes softened whenever Maria walked into a room, not out of romantic interest. Daniel never saw Maria that way, but out of pure respect and gratitude. To Vanessa, respect and gratitude weren't feelings she understood. She only understood control. "She's just the help," Vanessa would mutter to her assistant, Priya, whenever Maria's name came up. "But he treats her like she's family. It's embarrassing." What Vanessa didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Maria had noticed something. Something in the financial records she wasn't supposed to see. Something that didn't add up. And in 3 weeks, right before the wedding, that secret would surface in the worst possible way. For now, though, life at the Whitfield estate moved like clockwork. Daniel worked late nights closing a massive deal in Atlanta. Vanessa planned her dream wedding down to the smallest detail. Ivory roses, a live orchestra, 500 guests. And Maria quietly kept the household running, unaware that she had already become a target. It started on a Tuesday evening. Daniel was traveling for business, expected to return in 2 days. Vanessa had given the rest of the staff the night off, an unusual request, but not one anyone questioned. Only Maria remained, finishing the last of her duties before heading to her small apartment across town. She didn't know that Vanessa was watching her from the upstairs window. She didn't know that 2 men were waiting in a black SUV parked just outside the estate gates. And she certainly didn't know that this ordinary Tuesday night was about to become the most terrifying night of her life. As Maria stepped out into the cool evening air, keys in hand, she felt an odd chill run down her spine, the kind of feeling you get when something is wrong, but you can't quite name it yet. She should have trusted that feeling. Nobody expected the truth to come out like this. 3 days earlier, Maria had been organizing files in Daniel's private study, something she rarely did, but he'd asked her to help locate an old contract while his assistant was on leave. As she searched through a drawer of documents, she came across something odd, a folder labeled VC Holdings, tucked behind years of old tax records. Maria wasn't the type to pry, but something about the folder felt out of place. Daniel was meticulous. Everything in his study had a purpose, a system. This folder didn't belong. She opened it, just enough to see a stack of wire transfer records. Large sums of money, moved quietly over the past year, from one of Daniel's smaller investment accounts into an offshore account under the name Vanessa Cole. Not gifts. Not shared expenses. Transfers timed suspiciously close to major business decisions Daniel had made. Decisions that, according to the documents, hadn't performed the way he believed they had. Maria's hands trembled as she closed the folder. She wasn't an accountant, but she'd worked enough years in wealthy households to recognize the shape of something being hidden. And more than that, she recognized fear. Because now she was carrying a secret that could unravel a powerful woman's carefully built future. She didn't tell Daniel right away. Not because she didn't care about him. She cared about him more than she dared admit, in the quiet way loyal people often do. But she needed to be sure. She needed more than suspicion before she brought something like this to the man who had given her a second chance at life in America. So she waited. She watched. And in doing so, she made herself dangerous to the one person who could never allow the truth to surface. Vanessa had hired a private investigator months earlier, not out of paranoia but out of habit. Control meant knowing everything, including what the staff whispered when they thought no one was listening. When her investigator reported that Maria had been seen photographing documents in Daniel's study, Vanessa's carefully composed world cracked for the first time. She didn't panic outwardly. Vanessa never panicked outwardly. Instead, she made a call to 2 men she'd used before, back when she still ran in circles far from Charleston high society. Men who understood that some problems needed to disappear quietly, before the wedding, before Daniel found out the truth about where his money had really gone. She won't be hurt, Vanessa told them coldly, sitting in her car outside a diner on the edge of town. I just need her gone for a few days. Long enough to make her doubt herself. Long enough to make sure whatever she thinks she saw disappears with her. It was a lie, of course, the kind of lie people tell themselves to sleep at night. Because men like the ones Vanessa hired didn't deal in a few days. They dealt in fear, and fear had a way of spiraling out of anyone's control, including hers. That Tuesday night, as Maria walked toward her car under the dim estate lighting, the black SUV's engine started. She heard footsteps behind her. Too fast, too deliberate to be casual. She turned just in time to see 2 masked men emerging from the shadows near the gate. Maria Delgado, one of them said. His voice flat, businesslike, as if this were routine. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She dropped her keys and ran, toward the house, toward anywhere with light and people, but the men were faster. One grabbed her arm, twisting it hard enough to make her cry out. The other clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling her scream as they dragged her toward the SUV. "Please," she gasped between his fingers, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I didn't do anything." "Get in the car," the first man growled, shoving her toward the open door. She fought. She scratched, kicked, screamed against the hand over her mouth, but it was no use. Within seconds, she was forced into the back seat, her wrists bound, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give out from fear alone. Through the SUV's tinted window, illuminated by the porch light, she saw a figure standing at the top of the driveway. Vanessa. Watching. Not moving. Not calling for help. Just watching, with an expression Maria would never forget. Cold, satisfied, and utterly without remorse. As the SUV doors slammed shut and the vehicle screeched away into the rainy night, Maria realized, with growing horror, that the woman who was supposed to marry the man she trusted most in the world had just orchestrated her disappearance. And somewhere 30 minutes away, Daniel Whitfield's phone buzzed with a text message he wouldn't see for another 2 hours. A message that would change the course of everything. This is the moment everything fell into place. Daniel had cut his business trip short. A gut feeling, nothing more. The kind of instinct successful people learn to trust, even when they can't explain it. He'd left Atlanta hours earlier than planned, catching a late flight back to Charleston, restless in a way he couldn't quite name. It was nearly 10 p.m. when his car pulled into the estate. The house was dark except for the porch light, and something about the silence felt wrong. He walked inside, calling out for Vanessa, then for Maria. No answer. He checked his phone. A missed call from an unknown number, followed by a text. "We have your girl. Don't call the police. Instructions coming soon." His blood went cold. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen in his own foyer, mind racing. His first thought was disbelief. Surely this was some cruel prank. But then he noticed Maria's phone on the kitchen counter, her jacket still hanging by the door, and the overturned pot she'd clearly dropped in the driveway earlier that evening. This was real. He called Vanessa immediately. She answered on the third ring, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "Daniel, is everything okay? I was just about to call you. Where's Maria?" His voice was sharp, urgent. A pause, barely noticeable, but Daniel had spent 2 decades reading people in boardrooms. He heard it. "I don't know," Vanessa said. "She left hours ago." "Why, what's wrong?" Daniel didn't answer. He hung up and immediately called Marcus Reyes, a retired FBI agent who now ran private security for high-profile families across the South. Marcus had handled sensitive situations before. Quietly, discreetly, without drawing unwanted attention. "I need you here tonight," Daniel said. His voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "Someone's been taken. Someone who matters." While waiting for Marcus, Daniel searched his study, desperate for any clue that might explain why someone would target Maria. Sweet, quiet Maria, who'd never harmed anyone in her life. That's when he noticed the drawer, slightly ajar, papers not quite aligned the way he always kept them. The VC Holdings folder was gone. His stomach dropped as pieces began falling into place, pieces he hadn't wanted to see before. The wedding expenses that never quite matched Vanessa's explanations. The offshore account he'd caught a glimpse of once and dismissed as a misunderstanding. The unusual withdrawal patterns his accountant had flagged months ago, which Vanessa had brushed off with practiced ease. He had trusted her. He had ignored the small inconsistencies because he wanted to believe in the life they were building together. But now, with Maria missing and evidence disappearing from his own study, the truth crashed over him like a wave he could no longer outrun. Vanessa hadn't just been careless with money. She'd been stealing from him systematically for over a year. And Maria, sweet, loyal Maria, must have discovered it. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, along with 2 associates skilled in exactly this kind of crisis. They worked fast, tracing the unknown number's last location using resources most people didn't know existed, cross-referencing it with traffic camera footage near the estate gates. Within an hour they had a lead. A black SUV, registered under a shell company with ties to a man named Ricky Torres, a known associate of underground problem solvers who operated just outside the law, the kind of people who took jobs nobody wanted traced back to them. "We think they're holding her at a warehouse on the outskirts of town," Marcus said, spreading a map across Daniel's desk. "But we need to move carefully. If this is connected to whoever hired them, spooking them could put her in real danger." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Every second Maria remained missing felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. He thought about all the small moments, her quiet laughter in the kitchen, the way she always left a warm plate of food for him after late nights, the unwavering kindness she'd shown him even when she owed him nothing beyond her job. She wasn't just an employee. She was, in every way that mattered, someone he cared about deeply, a friend in the truest sense of the word. And somewhere out there, in a cold, dark warehouse, she was terrified, believing that no one was coming for her. "We move now," Daniel said, grabbing his jacket. "Whatever it takes." Little did he know, the woman he'd once planned to marry was watching his every move from the shadows of the estate library, phone pressed to her ear, already making the next call, because if her secret was about to unravel, she wasn't going down without making sure Maria never got the chance to tell it. Everything took a shocking turn. Maria had lost track of time. The warehouse was cold, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and rust. Her wrists were bound to a metal chair, her cheek throbbing from where one of the men had struck her when she tried to scream for help outside. She'd stopped crying somewhere around the second hour, not because the fear had faded, but because she'd run out of tears to give it. Instead, she focused on breathing, on staying alert, on remembering every detail she could in case she ever had the chance to tell someone the truth. The 2 men who'd taken her spoke little, mostly murmuring into their phones in hushed, clipped tones. But she caught fragments, enough to understand that whoever hired them was growing impatient, that there was disagreement about what to do with her next. "She's seen our faces," one man muttered. "This isn't what we signed up for." "Just wait for the call," the other snapped back. "We finish the job, we get paid, we're gone." Maria's mind raced. If they were arguing about what to do with her, it meant this had never been a simple kidnapping for ransom. It meant someone wanted her silenced, permanently if necessary. And she knew exactly who that someone was. She thought of Vanessa's cold expression in the driveway, the way she'd simply stood there and watched as Maria was dragged away. In that moment, any lingering doubt Maria had about the wire transfers vanished completely. Vanessa hadn't just been hiding money. She'd been willing to make a person disappear to protect that secret. Maria thought of her brother back home, still years away from finishing medical school, still counting on the money she sent every month. She thought of Daniel and how, despite everything, some small stubborn part of her believed, hoped that he would notice she was gone, that he would care enough to look. Around midnight, the warehouse door creaked open, and Maria's heart seized with dread as heavier footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. But instead of another masked stranger, a different man walked in, older, dressed in a plain gray coat, his face calm in a way that somehow felt more frightening than the 2 men who'd taken her. "Untie her hands," he said quietly. "Let's talk." The men obeyed without question, clearly deferring to him. Maria rubbed her raw wrists, watching him warily as he pulled a folding chair across from her and sat down, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You found something you shouldn't have," he said simply. "Financial records. Wire transfers." Maria said nothing, her jaw tight. I'm not here to hurt you, the man continued, his voice steady, almost gentle. But I need to understand exactly what you saw, and who else knows about it. For a long moment, Maria remained silent, weighing her options. Then, drawing on a courage she didn't know she still had, she lifted her chin and spoke. I saw enough to know she's been stealing from him for over a year, Maria said, her voice trembling but clear. And I know that whatever happens to me tonight, the truth doesn't disappear with me. Daniel isn't stupid. He'll figure it out eventually. And when he does, all of you, she looked around at the men in the room, will be the ones left holding the blame while she walks away clean. That's how people like her always work. The older man studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first flicker of conscience in a job he'd taken purely for the money. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer it, his expression darkening as he listened. Change of plans, he said when he returned, his voice tighter than before. We're moving her. Now. Maria's stomach dropped. Whatever conversation had just taken place on that call, it wasn't good news. Outside, unbeknownst to anyone inside the warehouse, 3 unmarked SUVs were approaching from the north access road. Headlights off, moving with the practiced silence of men who had done this kind of work before. Daniel sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the warehouse lights growing closer through the rain-streaked windshield. He wasn't going to be too late. He couldn't be. Don't blink. You'll miss the biggest twist. Marcus's team moved with precision, surrounding the warehouse from 3 angles while Daniel waited, tense and helpless, in the vehicle just beyond the tree line. Every instinct told him to run in himself, but Marcus had been firm. You go in there and something goes wrong, it's not just her life at risk anymore, Marcus had warned. Let us handle this. You'll get your chance. Inside, chaos was already unfolding. The moment the older man, whose name Marcus's team would later learn, was Elliot Grant, a fixer with a long history of quiet solutions for wealthy clients, had received his call, everything shifted. The call had been from Vanessa herself. She needs to be gone, Vanessa had said, her voice tight with panic she rarely allowed herself to show. Not just missing. Do you understand me? But Elliot Grant had built his reputation on discretion, not violence. Kidnapping for leverage, intimidation, disappearing someone temporarily to buy time. That was his business. Murder was an entirely different line, one he'd never crossed, and Maria's quiet, desperate plea moments earlier had struck something in him he hadn't expected. He'd worked in this world long enough to recognize when a client's demands crossed from desperate into dangerous. And something about Vanessa's icy insistence on Maria's permanent silence told him this job had just become far more than he'd bargained for. Get her in the van, he told his men, his voice clipped. We're not doing what she's asking. We're relocating her somewhere safe until I figure out how to handle this. It was, in its own twisted way, an act of conscience, but it was also the reason the timing became so critical, because as Maria was being led toward a side exit, Marcus's team breached the warehouse from 2 directions simultaneously. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Shouts of federal agents, hands where we can see them, echoed off the metal walls, even though Marcus's team wasn't technically federal anymore. A bluff that worked precisely because panic doesn't leave room for verification. The 2 younger men bolted, but Elliot Grant remained still, hands raised, his eyes finding Maria's across the chaotic room. Go, he said quietly to her, nodding toward the approaching lights. This isn't what I agreed to. Daniel burst through the warehouse doors moments later, ignoring every instruction to wait, his heart pounding as his eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on Maria. Bruised, shaking but alive, very much alive, sitting against a stack of crates, tears streaming down her face. Maria! His voice broke as he rushed toward her, dropping to his knees, pulling her into an embrace that neither of them had planned or expected, but that felt like the only thing that made sense in that terrifying, chaotic moment. "You came," she whispered against his shoulder, her body trembling. I didn't think anyone would come." "I will always come," Daniel said fiercely. His own eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Always. Do you understand me?" As paramedics arrived to check Maria for injuries, Marcus approached Daniel with Elliot Grant in handcuffs beside him. "You're going to want to hear what this man has to say," Marcus said grimly. "It's about your fiancée." Daniel's blood ran cold as Elliot Grant, facing serious charges and looking for any way to minimize his own culpability, began to talk about the phone call, about Vanessa's chilling instructions, about a year of financial theft carefully hidden behind wedding planning and charity galas. Every word landed like a physical blow. The woman he had planned to spend his life with, the woman who had stood in his home just hours earlier lying to his face, hadn't just stolen from him. She had ordered Maria's death to protect herself. As dawn broke over Charleston, Daniel Whitfield stood in a warehouse parking lot, watching the woman he thought he knew be walked out of his estate in handcuffs an hour later, her carefully constructed world collapsing in real time, while beside him, wrapped in a blanket, sat the woman whose quiet loyalty had never wavered, even when it nearly cost her everything. This story has an ending no one saw coming. The weeks that followed felt like a blur for both Daniel and Maria. Vanessa's arrest made headlines across the country. Charleston socialite charged in kidnapping plot against billionaire fiancé's housekeeper, the kind of scandal that tabloids couldn't resist. Reporters camped outside the estate gates for days, desperate for a statement, a photo, anything. Daniel gave none of it to them. Instead, he focused entirely on making sure Maria had everything she needed to heal. Therapy sessions with a trauma specialist, round-the-clock security until the investigation concluded, and above all, the space to process what had happened without pressure or intrusion. But healing, as anyone who has faced real trauma knows, isn't linear. Maria struggled in the weeks that followed. She jumped at unexpected sounds, avoided being alone in dark rooms, and found herself unable to shake the image of Vanessa's cold expression watching from the driveway. Some nights, she woke gasping, certain she was still bound to that metal chair in the warehouse. Daniel noticed everything. And slowly, carefully, without ever pushing, he became a steady presence through it. Sitting with her during difficult nights, driving her to appointments, simply being there in the quiet moments when words weren't enough. Something shifted between them during those weeks. Not romantic, not at first, but something deeper than either of them had words for. A bond forged not through comfort, but through crisis. Through the terrifying, undeniable truth that when everything fell apart, he had chosen her. "Why did you come for me?" Maria asked one evening weeks later, as they sat together on the same back porch where they'd shared so many quiet conversations before. "You could have called the police. Let them handle it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the garden. "Because somewhere along the way," he said finally, "you became one of the most important people in my life. And I couldn't sit at home waiting for a phone call while you were out there terrified, wondering if anyone even cared enough to look." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of fear. Meanwhile, the investigation into Vanessa's finances revealed a scope far larger than anyone initially realized. Nearly $2 million had been siphoned from Daniel's accounts over 18 months, funneled through shell companies Vanessa had set up before they'd even gotten engaged. She hadn't just been marrying Daniel for love, or perhaps she never had. Financial records suggested she'd targeted him deliberately years earlier, after research into his company's early success. The kidnapping charges, combined with the financial fraud, meant Vanessa was facing decades in prison. At her arraignment, she showed no remorse, her lawyer arguing procedural technicalities while she stared coldly ahead, refusing to make eye contact with either Daniel or Maria, who sat together in the courtroom gallery. For Daniel, watching her walk in shackles brought no satisfaction, only a hollow kind of grief. grief for 2 years of his life built on a foundation that had never been real, and gratitude, overwhelming and humbling, that the person who had shown him genuine loyalty had survived to see justice done. Elliot Grant, in exchange for his testimony and his last-minute decision to protect Maria rather than harm her, received a significantly reduced sentence. A small mercy that even Daniel, in a rare moment of grace, didn't fight against. As the legal proceedings continued through the following months, life at the Whitfield estate slowly found a new rhythm. Maria returned to her role, though everything about her relationship with Daniel had changed. Deepened, strengthened, built now on a foundation neither wealth nor status had ever provided. And in the quiet evenings that followed, something neither of them expected began to bloom, not out of trauma or gratitude, but out of two people who had faced the worst night of their lives and found, on the other side of it, that they didn't want to face anything without each other again. But it ended in a way no one imagined. 6 months after that terrifying night, Daniel stood in his study, the same room where Maria had once discovered the folder that changed everything. Holding a small velvet box he'd carried in his jacket pocket for nearly 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He wasn't nervous the way he'd been with Vanessa, rehearsing perfect words, calculating the ideal setting for maximum impact. With Maria it felt different, simpler, truer. He found her in the garden, tending to the roses she'd cared for faithfully even during the darkest weeks of her recovery. The late afternoon sun caught the gray streaks in her dark hair, and for a moment, Daniel simply watched her, overwhelmed by gratitude that she was here, safe, alive, and somehow impossibly, still willing to trust after everything the world had put her through. "Maria," he said softly, and she turned, smiling the warm, genuine smile that had become the anchor of his days. "I've been thinking about the night I found you in that warehouse," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I keep coming back to something you said, that you didn't think anyone would come for you." Maria's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more vulnerable. "I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wonder that again," Daniel continued, lowering himself to one knee, the small box open in his trembling hands. "Maria Delgado, you have shown me more loyalty, more courage, and more genuine love in the hardest moments of my life than anyone ever has. I don't want a life built on appearances anymore. I want a life built with you." Maria's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely as the weight of everything they'd survived together crashed over her. The fear, the pain, and now, impossibly, this. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Daniel, yes." Their engagement made headlines too, but for entirely different reasons than the scandal that had preceded it. Billionaire's rescued housekeeper, now his fiancée. A headline that, on the surface, sounded like a fairy tale, but beneath it carried a story of genuine partnership built through unimaginable adversity. Not everyone approved. Some of Daniel's business associates raised eyebrows at the unconventional match, whispering about class and appearances behind closed doors. But Daniel had learned, in the most painful way possible, exactly what mattered and what didn't. Appearances had nearly cost Maria her life. Substance, genuine tested loyalty, had saved it. Maria's brother flew in from Guatemala for the small, intimate wedding they eventually planned, nothing like the extravagant 500-guest affair Vanessa had once designed. Instead, it was held right there in the garden, under string lights, surrounded by close friends, staff who had become like family, and Marcus, who Daniel now considered one of his closest confidants. As Maria walked down a simple aisle of white petals toward the man who had once been her employer and was now her partner in every sense of the word, she thought back to that terrifying night in the warehouse, the moment she'd believed, with absolute certainty, that no one was coming for her. She had been wrong. Someone had come. And in doing so, he had rewritten the entire story of her life. What happened after that was beyond imagination. A year into their marriage, Daniel and Maria made a decision that surprised even those closest to them. Using a portion of the settlement recovered from Vanessa's seized assets, funds the court determined belonged rightfully back to Daniel, they established the Delgado Whitfield Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting domestic workers and immigrant families across South Carolina. The foundation provided legal assistance for workers facing exploitation, emergency housing for those escaping unsafe situations, and scholarship funds for the children of household staff, families like Maria's own, who dreamed of a better future but often lacked the resources to pursue it. "I know what it feels like to be invisible," Maria said during the foundation's launch event, standing before a crowd that included former colleagues, community leaders, and reporters who, this time, were there to celebrate rather than sensationalize. "I know what it feels like to work hard every single day and still feel like your voice doesn't matter. This foundation exists so that no one else has to feel that way." Her words, streamed live and later shared millions of times across social media, resonated deeply with audiences far beyond Charleston. Maria became an unexpected but powerful voice for domestic workers' rights, testifying before state legislators about labor protections, speaking at universities about resilience and second chances, and mentoring young immigrant women navigating a country that didn't always make room for their dreams. Daniel, for his part, restructured significant portions of his company's culture, implementing new policies ensuring fair treatment, transparent wages, and genuine respect for every employee, from executives in corner offices to the maintenance staff who kept those offices running. It wasn't corporate strategy or public relations. It was, quite simply, the direct result of everything he'd learned from loving someone the world too often overlooked. Meanwhile, Vanessa Cole's trial concluded with a conviction on all major charges: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice. She received a sentence of 18 years, an outcome that brought Daniel no joy, only a quiet, sober sense of closure. In an unexpected turn during sentencing, Vanessa's attorney revealed something that added a layer of tragic complexity to her actions. Evidence that Vanessa herself had grown up in poverty, the daughter of a single mother who worked multiple jobs as domestic help, treated poorly by wealthy employers who never once saw her as a full human being. Somewhere along the way, that painful history had twisted into something dark. A desperate, misguided belief that wealth and control were the only forms of safety worth pursuing, even if it meant becoming the very thing that had once harmed her family. Maria, upon hearing this, felt something unexpected. A flicker of sorrow rather than pure anger. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever fully, but understanding, the kind that comes from recognizing pain, even in someone who had caused you tremendous harm. Hurt people, Maria told Daniel quietly that evening. It doesn't excuse what she did. But maybe it explains it. Daniel took her hand, grateful as he so often was, for the depth of compassion Maria carried even after everything she'd endured. 2 years after that terrifying night in the warehouse, Maria gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Esperanza, Spanish for hope. As Daniel held his newborn daughter for the first time, tears streaming freely down his face, he thought about how close he'd come to losing everything that truly mattered, and how a single act of trust, noticing something wrong, refusing to ignore his instincts, choosing to fight for someone who had never asked him to, had led him to a life richer than any business empire could ever provide. Everyone thought they knew the answer. As the years passed, the story of Daniel and Maria became something of local legend in Charleston, not just for its dramatic beginning, but for the quiet, steady love that followed. Journalists occasionally revisited the story for anniversary pieces, always eager to explore the billionaire and his housekeeper angle, but Daniel and Maria consistently redirected the narrative toward something they felt mattered more: the thousands of families the foundation had helped, the policy changes their advocacy had influenced, the simple truth that dignity shouldn't depend on someone's job title or bank account. Maria's brother, the one she'd worked tirelessly to support through medical school, graduated and returned to Guatemala, opening a small clinic in their hometown, a clinic funded in part by the very foundation his sister had helped create. The full circle of that journey wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family's history. Elliot Grant, having served his reduced sentence, reached out years later through a letter delivered to the estate. In it, he expressed genuine remorse for his role in Maria's terrifying ordeal, explaining that the moment he'd overheard Vanessa's chilling instructions had haunted him ever since, becoming the catalyst for leaving that dark line of work entirely. He'd since taken a job in construction, ironically working for a small firm that, unbeknownst to him, had distant ties to Whitfield Development's earliest years. Maria, after much reflection, wrote back, not absolution but acknowledgement. Sometimes, she told Daniel, people find their way toward change even after terrible choices. It didn't erase what happened, but it mattered that he'd tried. Vanessa remained in prison, her once glamorous life reduced to headlines that faded with time, as public attention inevitably moved toward newer scandals, newer stories. Occasionally, Daniel received updates through legal channels. Nothing personal, simply procedural closure on a chapter he'd long since moved past emotionally, even as its consequences continued shaping his life in profound ways. The Delgado Whitfield Foundation expanded beyond South Carolina within 5 years, establishing chapters in 12 states, providing resources to over 10,000 domestic workers and their families. Maria, once a woman who had felt invisible in the very house she cared for, became a nationally recognized advocate, invited to speak at conferences, consulted by lawmakers drafting labor protection legislation, and celebrated, genuinely, deservedly, for transforming personal trauma into systemic change that helped countless others avoid the vulnerability she'd once faced. Their daughter Esperanza grew up surrounded by this legacy, understanding from a young age that her parents' love story wasn't really about wealth or rescue in the traditional sense. It was about two people who had chosen, again and again, to see each other's full humanity, even when the world around them insisted on reducing people to their job titles, their bank accounts, their perceived worth. Someday, Maria told her daughter, tucking her into bed one evening, years after that terrifying warehouse night had faded into a distant, healed memory, you'll understand that the people who truly love you don't just show up when it's easy. They show up in the storm, when everything feels impossible, when giving up would be so much simpler. Esperanza, only 6 years old, looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes. Like Daddy did for you. Maria smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. Exactly like that, Mija. Exactly like that. This is where everything changed forever. 10 years after that rainy night in the warehouse, Daniel and Maria stood together at the Foundation's 10th anniversary gala, hosted not in some exclusive ballroom, but in a renovated community center in the very neighborhood where many of the families they'd helped now lived stable, secure lives. Looking out at the crowd, former domestic workers now running their own small businesses, children who'd received foundation scholarships now graduating college, families who'd found safety and legal protection through resources Maria had fought tirelessly to establish, Daniel found himself overwhelmed with a gratitude that had nothing to do with his company's continued success or his substantial wealth. He thought back to the man he'd been before that terrifying night, successful by every conventional measure, yet somehow missing the deeper understanding of what truly mattered. It had taken almost losing everything to teach him that. Maria took the stage first, her voice steady and strong, carrying none of the fear that had once silenced her in that cold warehouse a decade earlier. 10 years ago, I was taken from my life because someone believed my voice, my knowledge, my worth as a person didn't matter enough to protect, she told the crowd, her eyes finding Daniel's in the audience. I was wrong to believe, even for a moment, that no one would come for me. Because someone did. And that single act of love and courage didn't just save my life. It changed the course of everything that came after. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. But this foundation isn't about my story alone. It's about every person who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, undervalued simply because of the work they do or the circumstances they were born into. It's about making sure that no one else has to wonder, in their darkest moment, whether anyone will come for them. The crowd rose in applause, many with tears in their eyes, understanding intimately the weight and truth behind her words. Daniel joined her on stage moments later, taking her hand, the same steady presence he'd become for her since that first terrifying night, and every day since. People sometimes ask me if I regret how our story began, Daniel said, addressing the crowd. The truth is, I regret every moment we lost trusting the wrong people, believing appearances mattered more than character. But I will never regret choosing to fight for someone whose loyalty and love turned out to be the realest thing I'd ever known. As the gala continued into the evening, filled with music, laughter, and the genuine warmth of a community transformed by resilience and second chances, Daniel and Maria stepped outside briefly, finding a quiet moment beneath the stars, much like they had on countless evenings over the past decade. "Do you ever think about that night?" Maria asked softly, leaning against him. "The warehouse." Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Every single day," he admitted. "Not with fear anymore, but with gratitude. Because that night taught me the difference between people who simply occupy your life, and people who are truly worth building a life with." Maria smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the stars scattered across the Charleston sky. The same sky that had once witnessed the most terrifying night of her life, now bearing witness to a love story that had grown from unimaginable darkness into something profoundly, beautifully whole. Sometimes, the people who change our lives forever don't arrive wrapped in wealth or perfect circumstances. Sometimes they arrive quietly, faithfully, showing up in the small moments long before the big ones ever test them. And when the storm finally comes, because it always does, it's not appearances that save us. It's the people who chose, long before anyone was watching, to be real, to be loyal, to be genuinely good. Daniel and Maria's story reminds us that true love isn't measured by status or circumstance, but by who shows up when everything falls apart, and who stays once the storm has passed. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. If you haven't already, subscribe, because we share stories just like this one every single week. Stories about love, resilience, and second chances. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that they matter, that someone will come for them, please share this story with them today. Thank you for watching until the very end. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of showing up for the people who matter most.